My name's Gordon Blair, the local councillor for Kerr ward and also an elder in the Church of Scotland, Sandbank. I had hoped that this discussion could have been held in a local church hall, but alas that wasn't possible. Thanks to the Burgh Hall for allowing us to hold the event here, and that was kind of them to encourage discussion and debate on the biggest constitutional change in our lives. Our two panellists this evening are David Kerr, journalist, Catholic Observer, and Reverend Tommy Bryson, whose skills not only as a preacher and historian, but also as a time-served electrician, which will be of particular help in this evening's discussions, throwing some ecumenical light onto the big referendum question. I just wanted to share with you briefly a few comments on what appears to be a major issue for some folk, and it's the notion that we have to let go of the rest of the UK. As a Christian, I found that letting go of people and things difficult, most recently saying goodbye to a much-loved father and following a house fire, many treasured possessions, and last week my many countrymen. It isn't easy letting go. In Scriptures, Christ gives us the strength to move on from a variety of circumstances. Reflecting on this notion of letting go, I recall while on holiday in Italy many years ago, I was given clear advice to let go when my wife and children cajoled me to go onto a flying fox, one of those swing things that goes across a swimming pool. I did as I was told. I went swinging across the swimming pool 30 feet in the air, and the attendants had clear advice to me was to let go before the bar hit the end of the pulley. As the velocity increased, I realised I wasn't going to let go. I was hanging on for dear life, and as I collided with the end of the cable ride, I hit the pulley. It flung me into a triple reverse somersault, ensuring I landed with a belly flop of such magnitude that it was like a biblical clap of thunder rattling round the whole of the water park. Tom Daly would not have been impressed at all. The pain was tremendous. I knew I was red as a lobster as I sunk to the depths of the pool, slowly returning to the surface, completely embarrassed. That experience I had in holiday many years ago, in a way, is how I see the future of Scotland if we don't let go of the Union now. The austerity cuts, which are well documented, will happen. Our whole society and country, other than the bubble which exists in the south east and around London, will sink down into the depths of austerity, and those at the bottom will drown. We will also be utterly embarrassed as the only country ever to reject independence following a democratic process, and that's not what I want. And as Christians, we have to search our own consciousness and think about the guidance Christ provides for a fair and equitable society and world. Christ indicates in the Gospels that sometimes it's necessary to cut back to allow new growth, and perhaps, hopefully, pruning the United Kingdom may well provide new and stronger growth for society in Scotland, and as a consequence, the remainder of the UK too. If we are worried about letting go of the rest of Britain, perhaps this is how we should look at it. New growth, new opportunities, and an equitable and fairer society. However, no more from me. However, just to remind you, tea and coffee are flowing, biscuits available, and we've got two excellent speakers. We're delighted to have David Kerr and the Reverend Tommy Bryson with us this evening. We'll have a brief resume from each of our guests now, and we can ask them as many questions as we like. The only time restriction is that David possibly going for the 9 o'clock boat, but if you keep him engaged, it might be the 10 o'clock boat. And we want everyone to feel relaxed and at ease. And remember, there are no daft questions. If you want to ask a question, put your hand up and let us know your name and where you're from. And to start us off, David will commence the proceedings. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you for all your organisation for this meeting. It's splendid to see so many people here on a night which is so beautiful, and on a night where Scotland play the world champions at football, which of course if we win that makes us the world championships. That was the rule in 1967, so it's the same now. Thank you very much for Michael for sorting out all the technology with reference to today's opinion poll, which you've seen across the papers. For a moment there, I thought it was not only the Better Together campaign who'd lost our lead, but Michael found our lead for us, and the projector is now working. So thank you very much to Michael, thank you very much to Gordon, thank you very much to Tommy for being here as well. I think the fact that you've got somebody who's a Catholic and somebody who's a Church of Scotland minister gives a sense of the breadth and the depth of this Yes campaign all across Scotland, and the ecumenical nature of Christians for Independence, which is the Christian element of the Yes campaign. Gone are those days of interdenominational dispute and rivalry. I always remember the story from the town of Coatbridge, where I've just travelled from, where my sister stays, and Coatbridge is very Irish Catholic. And there's always that story told of the fellow who was away for many years went on to become one of the world's great engineers, but he wanted to return home because his mum and dad were getting on a bit and he hankered after Scotland. So he went for a job at a firm in Coatbridge, flying colours in terms of the interview, stupendous CV. And at the end of it all, the boss said to him, "One final question, son. What school did you go to?" And of course the fella says, "I know what you're getting at." He says, "I go away for 30 years and I come back and things still haven't changed." "Well, if you must know, my mother's a Catholic, my father's a Protestant, and I'm neither. Now what about this job?" He says, "No problem, son. Your mother starts on Monday." Gone are those days. But I am here to give some explanation as to why somebody who's a Catholic and a practising Catholic would come to the conclusion that the best thing to do on September the 18th is to put an X or a tick, as long as it's in an obvious mark, next to the yes box in the referendum. And just to take you through how I've reached that conclusion. Now, the first thing to say as regards Christians for Independence, or Catholics who are for independence, simply because one is a Christian doesn't mean you have to be for independence. This is a car I came across in Edinburgh the other week, and I thought I just have to take the photograph. It's always somebody who's a Christian who's not for independence. So in terms of Christianity and independence, the conclusion of independence politically is a prudential judgment. What does that mean? That means that we Christians are working from the same principles but coming to different practical conclusions as to how best to put those principles into practice in reality. But obviously, the conclusion I come to as a Christian and as a Catholic is that yes is the best option for Scotland on September the 18th, and that we say no thanks to no thanks. And in terms of explaining that why, I'd like to take you back to away from 21st century Dunoon, and if I can take you to 19th century Belgium. I'm sure it's very difficult to wrench yourself away from 21st century Dunoon. I remember a few years ago I was walking through the borders of Scotland and I came to the town of Hoyk, and one of the best phrases I've ever come across in my travels, one of the locals said to me, "Aye son, a day out of Hoyk is a day wasted." And he meant it with all sincerity. So I'm sure a day out of Dunoon is a day wasted. But if I can take you from 21st century Dunoon and take you back to 19th century Belgium, and you find this man. Who is this man? This man is Bishop Vincenzo Pecci. He is an Italian, he's a young bishop, he is in fact the Pope's ambassador or the papal nuncio to Belgium. And in Belgium, he comes across this industrial revolution. After the British Isles, Belgium's the next country in Europe which industrialises. And Bishop Pecci sees at first hand the squalor and the poverty and the impoverishment that people face in the 19th century as a result of this industrial revolution, as people move from the countryside into the cities. So what's the significance of this man to our story? Because several years later, Bishop Pecci is elected in 1878 to the papacy. He becomes Pope Leo XIII. And he takes everything that he learned in Belgium and all he was shocked by, and he wanted to take 1900 years of traditional Christian social teaching and apply it to the smaller that he saw before him. And from that comes a modern development of what's been known as Catholic social teaching. But it's applicable to many of the Christian churches. And in 1891, he summarised it all in this landmark document. It's one of the big documents over the 2,000-year history of the church, called Rerum Novarum. All these documents to the church, they're known as encyclicals. You're getting a Latin lesson as well as some political education. which means on new things. And that was a document which he published in 1891 to say, look, here's how traditional Christian teaching can be applied to a modern setting in terms of tackling poverty and inequality and squalor and ignorance and disease. And really, it comes down to two key principles for there's really been 100 plus years since of development of that thought. But it comes down really to two key principles, both of which begin with S. Solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity is the Christian principle that we are all responsible for each other, in particularly the most vulnerable. Am I my brother's keeper? Solidarity says, yes, you are. And that goes against a lot of the thought that was current in the 19th century. The German political philosopher Nietzsche, who saw Christianity as the get-up by the poor and the feckless in order to shackle the rich and the bold and the beautiful into feeling responsibility for them, those who would have proposed of social Darwinism. The church very clearly said, no, solidarity, responsibility for each other, and particularly the poor. But the second principle you see there, subsidiarity, that care should be applied at the lowest possible level, starting with the person, the family, the community, the borough, the county, all the way up to the state and even to international level. And we have to decide where that power is best applied in order to apply solidarity. And subsidiarity is a principle which not only perhaps sounds good in theory, but it seems to work in practice. Unlike many people, I'm sure, who have come and spoken at Yes Scotland meetings in Argyll, who are very successful politicians, I walked by the office of Mike Russell, MSP, on the way up to the hall. I'm a very unsuccessful politician. I stood for election to the Westminster Parliament on 3 occasions, and on all 3 occasions have been, I think the psephologist's phrase is gubbed. And the last time I was gubbed at the ballot box was in 2009 in Glasgow North East. And for those who don't know where Glasgow North East exactly is, it's when you drive through on the M8 motorway and you come to Townhead, where the Royal Infirmary is, and Glasgow Cathedral. If you're coming from this direction, that's on your right-hand side. If you look up to the left, you've got places like Springburn and Royston, Milton. That's Glasgow North East. And Glasgow North East has the dubious badge of honour, very often topping the polls when it comes to poverty and inequality indexes, not just for the UK, but for Europe. Some of the most deprived communities in the whole of the continent you'll find there. But what I found time and time again, when I had the privilege of spending 6 to 9 months amongst the great people of these great communities, is that poverty was most readily and ably defeated when people and communities were genuinely empowered. That to some extent, big business wasn't interested in those communities. Tried to find a free cash point in some of the areas there, no chance. Big government, with their professionalised intervention, would often put in big money, but not often with the desired outcomes. Well, what you could see was that when people were empowered, those institutions which operated at a local level where small was allowed to be beautiful had a real impact in changing lives and changing the fortunes of communities. Housing associations, housing cooperatives, credit unions, food cooperatives, community initiatives, that when people were empowered, they do remarkable things. So that's 2 principles to say, solidarity and subsidiarity, all of which are there to serve the general principle of the common good. Okay, how does that apply to now? Well, really, the question we face on September 18th is a question of subsidiarity. Back in 1997, there we go, 1997, we had a demolition referendum. And again, if you remember the No campaign at the time, prophecies of doom and gloom, and businesses will leave and the economy will go down the pan. Sounds familiar? And in 1997, we didn't listen to those people, and we took the decision that we wanted significant powers over our lives repatriated from the level of London down to the level of our new national parliament in Scotland in order to serve the common good. So down came things like health and education, our legal system, environment, energy, and so on. All those things that the Scottish Parliament deals with until today. We decided that on the principle of subsidiarity, the common good was best served. Solidarity was best served by taking those powers from London and repatriating them to Scotland. And the question on September 18th, 2014 is those remaining powers that are London. Should we, as a prudential judgment, decide that those remaining powers should be repatriated to Scotland for the common good? And the kind of three big powers that remain in London are obviously foreign policy, defence, and the economy, including welfare. What I'd like to do tonight is just go through those 3 points in order to open up a discussion on these matters about where I'm coming from, where a Catholic would be coming from, using Catholic social teaching to come to the conclusion of this. First off, foreign policy. You'll recognise that. First thing I saw as I got off the boat, off the Argyll ferry, the War Memorial in Dunoon, and I stopped off and I counted up the names. And it's 120 deep, 4 columns, just shy of 500 names. And of course, one of the saddest things, and you see this all across Scotland, in every town, in every community, the sheer volume of names. And then the saddest thing is when you look closely and you see the same family name repeated again and again and again. Andrew McKelvey, Dennis McKelvey, Patrick McKelvey, are they brothers, cousins, father, son? Every community in Scotland was so badly affected by the Great War of 1914 to 1918. In fact, I was at a talk on Friday by Sir Tom Devine, the great historian, who's calculated that the Great War, in terms of the Great War, Scotland actually suffered the highest rate of mortality of any nation, along with Turkey and Serbia, but the Turks and the Serbs perished in great number due to illness and disease, whereas with Scots it was actual battle deaths. And it's a reminder of an old phrase of my late grandfather who used to say that Britain will always defend her empire right down to the last Scottish soldier. And that war memorial, that war of 1914 to 18, so commemorated, nigh on celebrated by some of our London politicians recently, that's a reminder of what happens when we don't control our own foreign policy. It's not just an optional extra, it's a necessity in terms of the life and the death of so many young Scots over so many generations. Because what happened then is what happened for the previous several hundred years since we gave away our foreign policy, really in 1603, when King James VI went to London and became King James I. And it still goes on to this day. When you think back to 2002, 2003, at that time I was working as the assistant editor of Newsnight in London. I was for 2 years Jeremy Paxman's boss. Didn't always feel like that, but on paper, I was his boss. Terrifying man, great man. And in the run-up to that invasion in Iraq, the majority of the Scottish people said, we do not want this war, this is not in our name. What's more, the majority of our members of Parliament in London voted to say, many of them against their own party, to say that the case for war had not been made by Tony Blair, and yet we still went to war. And that's because we don't control our own foreign policy. And the consequence was that 180 British servicemen died. There's over 100,000 Iraqi civilians and counting who have died. And we see the carnage and the chaos that continues to this day, and the instability that afflicts that region, including, in terms of particular to this meeting, the decimation of the Christian churches in Iraq. And we didn't have a say And we get dragged into a war that we didn't want and we didn't vote for. And that's the reality of not controlling our own foreign policy. And that's why on September the 18th, in terms of subsidiarity, in terms of shaping our own foreign policy, we can take powers from London and repatriate them to Scotland, not just in issues of war, but issues of peace as well. This is our new, I'm sure you all recognise him. That's our new Foreign Secretary, UK Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond, who replaced William Hague a couple of months ago. And do we really believe in all those chambers of the world where Scotland's interests should be represented? The European Union, or the United Nations, or this NATO summit that's been meeting in Wales, that when Philip Hammond goes into that debating chamber, or that negotiating room, that the common good of the people of Scotland, in particular the most vulnerable, is top of his priorities, or even in his top 10 priorities? Of course it isn't. And no other country would accept that second best, third best status, and neither should we. And that's why I think we should normalise our status and repatriate those powers. Subsidiarity on foreign policy, September 18th, a reason to vote yes. Point number 2, defence. After leaving the BBC in 2009, I had a few jobs. 2010 I worked on this man here, Pope Benedict XVI, his visit to Scotland. And then, just in case he thought he had a stalker, I followed him to Rome for 2 years, where I was a Vatican correspondent, freelance journalist. And living in Rome, a great privilege. The ability to get dressed each morning, knowing that the weather's going to be very warm, that there's a gelato waiting for you in every corner if you so choose, that there's art and beauty and history around the next corner. It's a splendid place to live. And it was a great privilege to be there. But one of the great privileges of being there was getting to follow this man and report upon this man, Pope Benedict XVI. I felt a very saintly man, also a great scholar as well. And every year he would address the Vatican's network of diplomats. The Holy See has the oldest diplomatic network of any entity in the Western world. And of course, it's perhaps worth noting that the Holy See also treats Scotland as an independent country, so September the 18th will just be playing catch-up with these guys. But every year, Pope Benedict, or the Pope, calls back all the ambassadors to address them on what he believes to be the great foreign policy concerns that they should be attuned to. And then he said this in one of the speeches which I had the privilege to cover. He said to his diplomats, he said, one of the most serious challenges is increased military spending and the cost of maintaining and developing nuclear arsenals. Enormous resources are being consumed for these purposes when they could be spent on the development of peoples, especially those who are poorest. Again, you see that social teaching coming through. And boy, does that pertain to the question that faces us on September the 18th as regards defence. Should it remain in London, or should we repatriate that power to Scotland? Because we have got a situation, as we sit and stand here tonight, we're not too far from here. We've got a London government who's prepared to spend over £100 billion on a new generation of nuclear submarines. When, again, not too much further up the Clyde, we've got postal districts where men die at an average age of 53. And to have that wanton spending on weapons of mass destruction and that wanton deprivation and loss of life, cheek by jowl, and to have a government that's so unresponsive and so unmoved by that juxtaposition, I think is jarring. And what's more, again, in a point of just democracy, in 2007, our members of Parliament in London said they didn't want Trident replaced. Our members of the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh said they didn't want Trident replaced. And the majority of the Scottish people say they don't want Trident replaced, and yet we can't do anything about it because defence is controlled here are there in London and not here in Scotland. And not only are these weapons immoral, because they're indiscriminate in terms of their killing, they're also, as we can see from recent developments in places like Iraq and Syria, they're utterly useless. What use is a submarine loaded with nuclear weapons if you're trying to tackle a military situation in the hills of northern Iraq? So again, I think in terms of the common good, there's a real case to be made that defence priorities are better dealt with, not at the level of London, but in terms of subsidiarity, repatriated to Scotland. Final point, the economy. It's not often at a Yes Scotland talk you'll get David Cameron quoted, but I don't know from the first, but there we go, the Union flag, David Cameron, very counterintuitive. But at the start of this campaign, they've kind of changed their tune a wee bit. I think he put his finger on the economic situation as regards Scotland and the choice we face September 18th. David Cameron says, supporters of independence will always cite examples of small, independent and thriving economies such as Finland, Switzerland and Norway. It would be wrong to suggest that Scotland could not be another such successful independent country. I think he said that on the BBC. It's just a shame that his minions and the campaign team who have been rolled out since on his behalf have not kept to that supposedly positive message. But what it highlights is that what we all know is that Scotland is a wealthy nation. And there's a disconnect between the wealth we earn and how that's applied in terms of trying to promote social justice. How does that happen? Well, again, let me counterintuitively quote another UK government minister, in this case a Liberal Democrat, Vince Cable. Vince Cable late last year and then again in Glasgow in July made the point that London is, quote, becoming a kind of giant suction machine, draining the life out of the rest of the country. And it's economic control in London is hampering the Scottish economy's prospects, opportunities, ability to be competitive and to generate growth. Why is that? Because within a one-size-fits-all fiscal policy, which is the United Kingdom, where we're up against the powerhouse, as Vince Cable identifies, of the southeast of England, we have no fiscal flexibility in order to compete. Even if, again, just sort of to take my career full circle, after I worked in Rome, I then worked in the United States for a year in Washington, DC. And even across the United States, each of those 50 states has fiscal flexibility in order to incentivise business start-up, inward investment, according to what they're good at. Otherwise, all the businesses in the US would simply go to New York or to California. But let's say Utah or some of those, or Oregon or Washington State up in the northwest, if they feel that they want to incentivise a particular industry, they can use the variation they have in tax powers in order to draw in certain businesses or to try and incentivise certain sectors. We can't do that within a one-size-fits-all United Kingdom. And so you end up with a situation where London, as Vince Cable says, sucks the economic life out of the rest of the British Isles, or sent out of the rest of the United Kingdom. And that's not just to Scotland's disadvantage, that's also to the disadvantage of the regions of Northern England and Western England. You know, very often when the Better Together, the No campaign, talk about the greatness of the United Kingdom, being that we can pool and share resources, very often what they're suggesting is that the City of London can earn the wealth that can pay the welfare bills in Newcastle or in Liverpool or in Glasgow. And that's really no way for anybody in the British Isles to live. And what a yes vote on September 18th does is it starts to decentralise economic power in the British Isles. I think it's no surprise that the further north you go in England, the higher the support for Scottish independence. Even some of those great Northern English politicians like Peter Kilfoyle, the great socialist of Liverpool, coming out a few weeks ago and saying he would vote yes if he lived in Scotland. I think it's an opportunity to create a win-win situation for all the parts of the British Isles. And I think as Christians, we would have a slight reluctance to the message that somehow independence would engorge us financially but impoverish our brothers south of the border. But I think it's a false dichotomy that doesn't exist in reality. Independence starts to break up the power structure of the British Isles that will benefit not only the most vulnerable in Scotland, but the poorest in Newcastle and in Manchester and in Liverpool too. But of course, as Christians, we're not simply interested in an economy on the basis of the wealth it creates. It's also then how we use that wealth to make the good society. Pope Francis, one of the key things that he always stresses is inequality, stressing this teaching of the Church. And this is the final point. Excessive economic and social disparity between individuals and peoples of one human race is a source of scandal and militancy against social justice, equity, human dignity, as well as social and international peace. And amongst all the nations of the West, those countries which belong to the OECD, the club of Western rich nations, the United Kingdom is the third most unequal state. And yet that doesn't seem to prick the conscience of our present lords and masters in the British Cabinet, on the British Parliament. And it's not just a George Osborne thing or a David Cameron thing or a Tory thing. That disparity between rich and poor has got worse every year since 1973. It's not a Tory thing, it's not a Labour thing, it's a Westminster thing. And a vote for yes, September 18th, a vote on the principle of subsidiarity to repatriate economic power from London down to the level of Scotland, and even, I think there's arguments, and we can discuss this, to bring things even further down again. That's something, another reason, economically, in terms of a fairer society as well as a more prosperous society, to vote yes, September 18th. So that is the Catholic case for the yes. I'd conclude simply by saying that with 11 days to go, I saw somebody posted up on Facebook the other day that what we're dealing with on September 18th, it's not nationalism, it's normalism. And the normal state of affairs for any country is to govern itself. And Scotland, and we the people of Scotland, we're no better than anybody else, but we're no worse. And if every other country can do it, including those 50 plus countries that have become independent from London ever since George Washington got the ball rolling in 1776, then we can do it too. And in September the 18th, we've got two futures that lie ahead for us. And the nature of both futures is that there's a degree of uncertainty attached to both. But one of the best things that happened to me during this campaign, as well as today's opinion poll figures, is when I was doing a tour of the Western Isles talking, and on the island of Battersea, I got engaged to a very nice American girl. I like her anyway, called Jackie Stamp, who's a nurse from Rhode Island, and we get married later this year. And I don't know what future holds for me and Jackie. I don't know if we'll be wealthy, I don't know if we'll be healthy, I don't know if we'll have children. Please God, we'll be happy, whatever happens. But what we're doing on a beach in July on Battersea with a picnic and a diamond ring is saying, with the information we have at hand, looking towards the inevitable uncertainty that is the future, this is the best vehicle we can create in order to deal with that inevitable uncertainty that will arise down the line in order to grow and flourish and prosper. And that's the same for Scotland on September the 18th. Two futures, but there's one which I think is inevitable decline, and one that gives us great opportunity and great hope. So for those three reasons I've outlined tonight, and particularly in the principle of subsidiarity, I'd obviously urge you on September 18th to vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to go over to Reverend Tony Bryson. Thank you, Tony.
I'll try and do my best, and I'll try and follow on from David. And I'll take it from a different angle and a different perspective, from a personal and a practical perspective. I was born in Glasgow and made in Fife. Both my parents come from mining families, and I basically lived in a mining village right up until I went into the ministry. And I'm going to take you from there. I'm going to show you the practicalities of what's happened over the last 55 years, in a sense, and try to encourage Christians that it's okay to vote yes. It's okay to vote for yourself. And I'll try and highlight historically and through the church what has happened over the years. And for my background in coming here, I tried to look at some of my old papers, my university papers in Scottish history and Scottish ethnology, to try and get an angle to present to you tonight. So I'm really making this up as I go, so it's purely from the heart. My first 2 years of life, I was homeless. My mother and my father, they went different ways and strays. But for the first 2 years of my life, I was homeless. I don't know what my mother did for those 2 years to survive. We ended up in Fife, in Buckhaven. And my father, God love him, he was a hard-working man, a bit of a lovable rogue at times, but he ended up almost being killed in the Michael Pit in Fife, where he was 5 years in calipers. And we actually existed on his assortment, his allocation of coal. So every quarter of the year, this big lumpy coal, it was something like, he got 2 tonne of an allocation, it was dropped at the doorstep. So what he did to survive in those days, because the welfare was really just new and fresh, what he had to do was sell a bag of coal to the butcher, a bag of coal to the grocer, in order to make ends meet. My mother and my father, for entertainment, what they would do is go to the movies, the picture house in Dunfermline, and what they would do is they would go to make sure that there was 2 sittings of the film, and they'd buy 1 ticket because that's all they could afford. So my father would go in and watch the first sitting, and then he'd sneak out and then give my mother the ticket to go in and do the second sitting. So that's the background of really where I'm coming from. I'm coming from about 100 years of being in the mines and in the coals. My grandfather had to spend 2 years of his life working in England because he was ostracised in Fife because he was a union leader. And they went on strike in 1926 and he had to flee Cowdenbeath in order to find work. He had 6 of a family, and you could just imagine the poverty that they lived in, had no running water. And the stories my grandmother always told was that after a hard day's work in the pit, they would come in, and my grandfather was always first to use the big basin in front of the fire, where my gran would fill up with hot water. And my grandfather was first to wash, then it was the eldest son, then it was my father, because he was the second oldest, and down the line. And that's how we lived, and we lived in that abject poverty. Even when it came to the 60s and the 70s, and in the 70s I nearly died of malnutrition, and I ended up in a coma for 3 years because of poverty. So that's my background. And Christianity, in a sense, from 1926 in Scotland, you maybe never hear this from anybody in the Church of Scotland, but 1926, and this is a very important aspect of the church history, that they were asked to support the miners in 1926 because they went on strike for 1.5 pennies a week. And what happened was the Church of Scotland shut them down, and they turned their back on their benevolence to feed the families and the children. So today, in a sense, the Church of Scotland shot itself in the foot because of money. And what I'm trying to say here today is that The root of all evil is money. And throughout this campaign, what I've saw and I've experienced on the television coming from politicians is they all speak about economy. They all speak about the thing that Jesus Christ spoke up against most, was the money and the love of money and the root of all evil. So I've had to live through that evil which the love of money has produced. In dire straits and in real poverty. When I came into the church and I began my education, you could say, at New College in Edinburgh, I got to my third and fourth year and I was doing my final dissertation, and I decided that what I was going to do was I was going to write up about the hidden poverty in Scotland. I lived in the heart of Argyll, the heart of Scotland, and all around me were miners who had been made redundant, who this government under Mrs. Thatcher, and we will never forget, the miners, will ever forget what she did to the miners. I was working at Moss Morning Fife at the time, and we were always given 10% of our wages in Moss Morning to feed the miners during that time. There were 600 electricians, there was about 1,500 workers altogether, and we all put in at least £20 a week to support the miners at that time. Now, I grew up in that environment, and I was a staunch Labour man. Absolutely staunch. Through and through, it's in there. When I was at New College, they said that they were sure I had a sickle and a hammer tattooed on my chest. So really, in a sense, I started to have a look, and I was trying to do this dissertation. So I went to the miners round about me, because many of them were unemployed now. Some of them had got a lump sum. My next door neighbour, Ian Dennis, his name was, he had got £23,000 as a lump sum for his redundancy. Within a year, Ian had spent it all, and he was an alcoholic. He couldn't handle that kind of money. So me and a friend who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, middle class, whatever, private school, public school boy, we decided that we were going to do the same dissertation, the hidden poverty in Scotland. So Stuart and myself, we decided to interview the amount of people who were around us and who I knew were living in poverty. So we interviewed Ian next door, and Ian said, okay, fine. So we went in, and him and his wife were having a wee bit of disturbance. So we were hidden in this bedroom, and it was almost like, Secret Service. We were in there. And he was an Orangeman, he was a loyalist. And he says, right before you get this interview, he says, you'll have to pay for it. So we dug in, we were students, I was looking after the family, and we only had about £10 between us. He says, that'll do. So we got talking and we got speaking, and he was telling us about him being an Orangeman and being a loyalist. They had this tattoo on his arm, and Stuart being Stuart, he's never been in that environment before between Catholic and Protestant. You see, he said to Ian, he says, you'll be a Christian then. A Christian. He says, oh, no, I want nothing to do with that. I'm a Protestant. You see, what I discovered when I was actually studying the hidden poverty in Scotland is in the lack of education. It's not so much that they hadn't got the guile or the understanding or the instinct to survive. But what it is many things that they deprive. And sometimes it's history, sometimes it's ideology, and sometimes it's theology. And sometimes it's just pure deprivation altogether because they don't know any other life. sometimes when I came to Argyll and I live in Tarbert, and I've discovered, you know, that you can be isolated. But in these communities, what had happened to the miner was that there was a created isolation. And there had been a created isolation for maybe 50 or 60 years. So that was when I discovered that I'd grown up in isolation. And I didn't know any better until I got an education. And then when I came back and I did this paper about the hidden poverty in Scotland, which nobody ever really sees. If you're middle class or you've got a job, you're working, or you're doing well for yourself, you're understanding that life is that is life for everyone. But it's not. There are many hidden poor people in Scotland, and I discovered that. I really did. Because I discovered that, I was involved in, this might not sound Protestant, but I got involved with a theology called liberation theology. And I really got involved and influenced by a guy called Jose Miranda. Now, to give you an idea and an example, it really fitted into my book because I was a socialist. I really was embedded in what Kerr and all these people had done. That the Labour Party was for the poor. So I got involved with Jose Miranda and his books and many things like that. And just for a typical example, his titles were Jesus Christ was the first communist, Communism and Christianity. You've got to remember my background as an apprentice electrician gave me the privilege of working alongside and being involved with a man from Argyll who was actually the secretary of the Communist Party. So he really influenced me deeply into the Labour movement, taught me the origins and where it all came from. So I saw that, and that's where I'm coming from. And I see many, many Christians who are coming from that background, who are in there, who never get the chance. And then I moved from that place, and I came into the church environment and the so-called Christian. And then I discovered and realised there were two types of Christianity involved in my country. One accepted peace and tolerance and understanding, and they were the poor. And the other was the middle class and the upper class, who everything was going well for them, who were so blind to the poor that Jesus spoke about and taught about, they couldn't see. So, as a minister in the Church of Scotland, I'm between a rock and a hard place. My gospel that I would like to preach and teach and show everybody is quite contrary to the middle class church I'm actually in today. Even though we preach it, we don't practice it. And in Scotland there is still poor. And sometimes we get a variance with that because we think it doesn't exist, but it does. And getting to the political side, it's all created by the love of money. I can assure you, the love of money is the root of all evil. We don't feel it if we're well off. We don't feel it if we're in work. We don't feel it when things are going well. We don't feel it when we are healthy and wealthy. We don't feel it whatsoever. But when you grow up in it and through it, and you've actually been there, then you begin to realise that when you get ridiculed for your language that you grew up in the school with, when you get ridiculed for being Scottish, and everybody envisages in the world that we all run about wee tammy shanters and we've all got ginger hair. That's when you begin to feel it as a son of Scotland. That's when you begin to feel these things. Now, Jesus Christ for me is a liberator. He liberates us, he gives us a freedom. And this is where Jose Miranda came in for me, because he showed me that Jesus Christ is a liberator. He liberates the people from those who have much. I've never been a member of any political party whatsoever. And I gave a sermon a long time ago, and it was called, Jesus Christ is a liberator. And I first started off when I said, look, I am a member of the Jesus Christ Liberation Party. And everybody looked at me and wondered what that was. I says, I'm a member of the Jesus Christ Liberation Party. And they're all going, oh, Bath, like this. And that's what I am as a minister. I'm a member of his party. Now, you maybe never heard of that before, but I reckon I'm about the only liberation theologian in the Holy Scotland. And I'm for the poor. And we need to separate us, and we need to identify what's been oppressing us for the last 800 years. My ancestors and the gentry, the aristocracy in Scotland, selling us down the chutty for a wee bit of land and a wee bit of money. That thing in your pocket. Highland clearances and all these things, all these historical things are very important, and they've laid a mark on everybody in Scotland. And for some unknown reason, because we are so oppressed, we are blind to these things, because we have been subjugated and conditioned into accepting the things that we are given. To such a degree that in Tarbert, for example, my session clerk, she was ostracised, and she got the belt, a Logelly special, for Fife, because she spoke the Gaelic in the playground, because it was banned. How shocking and how disturbing. And the majority of my fellow kinsmen who Scotland, the people who even sing Scotland the Brave, or Flower of Scotland. I did Margaret Ewan's funeral, and all the SNP were there. I'm not an SNP, but I was really good friends, and probably still are, with Winnie Ewan. She was a member in my church. And I used to go up and sit beside Winnie and her sister-in-law. And we had some fantastic chats about politics, and I didn't realise that she didn't know as much as what I thought she did. But anyway, when Margaret's funeral started, I started off singing O Flower of Scotland. See, when we'll see the likes again. You see, we sing these songs, and it's just like hymns. We have all these words, but we never take them in. I've been watching my TV and the politics and the politicians on the television, Alex Salmon and Alistair Darling, Gordon Brown, what's that other man, Jim Murphy, is it? And I can't believe that my Labour MPs, the people who I looked up to a long time ago, are using the language and supporting something that's oppressing their own people. I can't understand it whatsoever. Not one thing, and I'm saying to myself, can you not understand what they are saying? They're not for Scotland whatsoever. They're only out for themselves. When I came up with history, my wee history lesson here, I don't know whether many people understand how the Union of Parliament came about. Do you understand how it came about? It come by corruption. We were bought and sold for silver, 30 pieces of silver. When Robert Burns was asked about the Union of Parliaments a way back in 17 whatever, this is what he said: "O would or I had seen the day that treason thus could sell us. My all grey head had lain in clay with Bryson and loyal Wallace. But pith and power till my last hour, I'll mark this declaration. We are bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rose a nation." Now that man was closer to any of us here. I believe that at least in that man's heart and mind and soul, there is still solidarity. So I'm saying, as a Christian, and you have been empowered as a Christian to vote yes by Jesus Christ our Lord. Everybody thinks that, that Jesus wasn't political, but he was. He was for the poor. He died for the poor. He didn't die for the rich. Can you remember the parable of the feast, the great feast? When he actually invited all the rich people in the world to come to the feast. And they turned them down because they were too busy. They had companies and businesses and everything like that to look after. So what did he do? He invited the poor into the kingdom of God. And then because the poor were enjoying themselves that much, what happened? The rich said, oh, we'll have to get in on this. So they all started to try and get into the kingdom of God. And then God saw through them. Didn't matter whether they called themselves Christians or not, whether they went to the church regular as religious people. What God saw was he saw right through them, through their richness, and through their good clothes. And he said to his servants, he says, get rid of them and take off their wedding clothes. And do not allow them into the kingdom of God. And what happens is, we Christians are never taught these things. What Jesus Christ really said, and what he was really against. He was against the rich people. He was against those people who oppress the poor. Who cause people like myself to endure hardship and struggle. And when we get political, what happens is we go, oh, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to be like that as a Christian. You're not supposed to stand up against injustice. But then he turns around and teaches us a parable about the Good Samaritan. And then we forget about that. I don't mind the hardships and the war. I'm a chaplain to the Royal Forces. I'm in a sense a loyalist as well. I love my queen and I love my country. But she's our queen first. She's Scottish. Above English, she is Scottish. I had a conversation with Angus Robertson on this, and we were sitting down having a cup of tea and a good blather, and we were there for a couple of hours. And I said to Angus, and he is a fantastic politician, by the way. I reckon if he had been in any other party, he would have been Prime Minister, and a great Prime Minister. That man is an intelligent man. I sat down with him and I was saying to him, Angus, what you need to do is you need to make yourself redundant. You need to work hard at the policies in Scotland to make sure that you do yourself out a job. And he says, you are right. That's what I am working for. I'm working to make myself redundant. Because we have 3 tiers of government. We have the Westminster MPs, we have the MSPs, and we have European MPs. To me, that's one of the most governed countries in the world. It's incredible. And for me, this is the betrayal, this is the Judas of today, is the Labour Party. The Judas of today is the Labour Party, and they're selling their soul for 30 pieces of silver. Gordon Brown, the son of the Mans. Alistair Darling, public school boy. Jim Murphy, I didn't care where he's coming from. But at the end of the day, they're selling us down the chute because what happens? They're not like Angus Robertson. Angus is trying to do himself out a job. They're trying to keep themselves in a job. And that's what I see as a Christian. And I can see the truth because Christ taught me how to see the truth. That the root of all evil is money. Now that's where I'm going to stop. And I'm just going to encourage any Christian who's listening or hearing, or yourselves, it's all right to say yes. Even if you're a loyalist, understand that the union of the crowns is different from the union of Parliament. Totally, completely different. The English didn't have royal bloodline to follow. So they fell on the Scottish bloodline because it's the oldest, one of the oldest in Europe. And we go back to Kenneth MacAlpine, and I'm just baffled and bamboozled at people who say they're Christian and have never studied what it means to be a Christian Scottish person. And that's the background, and that's why we should say yes. It's important. This is a very important thing. And the last thing I want to say is, I've always listened to God and tried to understand what He says. And throughout my ministry, it's been incredible. And I've always heard Him saying, Tommy, this is an opportunity. When I was in my first charge, the first child who I baptised was battered to death because the social services failed, because of lack of money, because of politics and many other things. And I was trying to do something about it, and I created this all-resource centre. And unfortunately, the politicians tried to get in the road there, and it was during the time when we had that, was it mad cows? Foot and mouth. You see, in the piles of fire and everywhere in Dumfries. And Wendy Alexander announced that they were already putting £6.5 million in. But I was the chair of a project that got that money in. And I gave her an email. I don't even know whether she read it or not, but it was about 3 or 4 pages long. The next thing I knew that she was resigning. So you can see where I'm coming from, and I'm saying to Christians, look, don't just vote with your heart, because your heart's embedded in the culture you grew up in. I'm saying vote with your mind and some understanding of the gospel. The gospel is for the poor. You know, Jesus never came to make us rich and wealthy. You know, you know, when Jesus Christ, just another wee bit, because I could go on forever. You know, when Jesus Christ was crucified, and He died, He was taken down for the cross. Do you know the one thing it tells us in the Bible we ignore? That he was buried in a rich man's tomb, and he was ashamed. They were ashamed to put him in a rich man's tomb. We don't see that. We don't preach that. And we don't understand that. I'm really thankful for I get this wee opportunity to give you a wee bit of my theology and my wee bit of understanding of Christianity. Just to help you and make you understand that, you know, the yes votes for the poor. The yes votes for our future. The yes votes for my grandchildren, so they didn't get stigmatised for speaking like myself, or having an accent, or when you fall back when you're tired and you're dishevelled and you get slated because of your upbringing. I'm proud to be a Scotsman. I'm proud of my upbringing. I'm proud of my Labour connections. But you know, this is a great opportunity to show the world how you can do it without lifting the gun or the bomb, or being nasty and evil, or being a tyrant. You know, it's a great opportunity. So please don't miss it. Don't miss it at all. This is what Jesus Christ is about. You know, the kingdom of God is at hand.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but that's been really inspirational listening to these two gentlemen. It's been absolutely wonderful. And some of the things that have been said have touched raw nerves in my history in Scotland and in Falkshaw's in Glasgow. You know, talking about the big bath. I remember my grandfather having a big bath in front of the coal fire, you know, and working long hours, etc., etc. That's the kind of history we've got. So I can only thank you both very much. Now, it's your turn to ask whatever questions you would like. If you'd like to stick your hand up and just say who you are and where you're from, where you stay, and we'll be delighted to answer any questions. Thank you.
I'm Alison McKinnon, I live in Dunoon, but I didn't always live here. I've lived half my adult life abroad, about 4 or 5 of those in Germany and 10 in the United States, and 5 of those were working with gangsters, pimps, prostitutes, thieves, crackheads, smackheads, potheads, and various other aspects of what people in Dunoon don't normally get access to, and you normally see on television, and that's probably the closest you get to it. of the possibility of a yes vote yet. We have a chance for the first time in probably 500 years to cut off from a system of usury. We really do. We do not need to go down to London and join currencies with the Bank of England. The Scottish pound is a fully reserved currency. It is unlinked with the Bank of England. The Bank of England is a fiat currency immersed in debt in a bank that's 90% owned by foreign individuals. What I want you to think about is this, that system has enslaved this country for the last 100 years and currently in neoliberal, with the neoliberal economic policy is going to enslave us further into at least another 20 years of austerity. God doesn't want us to do that. We were set free. We have become unequally yoked with a system that I, as a Christian, cannot work with. We have a chance in Scotland, and nowhere else in the world is this possible at the minute, to actually disengage from the central banking system. That is a phenomenal choice. We can do it. It's been done before. The Bradbury pound 100 years ago was a currency based around the wealth of the people, not on the ability to borrow from a bank. There are so many currencies or cryptocurrencies that we can use in a system in Scotland that would make us one of the richest nations on earth. This is not pie in the sky stuff. That is a reality if we choose to use it.
Do you have a question you'd like to put to the panel?
Would the churches be willing to actually take a serious look at what a currency union would be with England? And if they looked at that union with the Bank of England, would they be willing to say no to a currency union?
Any comment on that?
In terms of, I suppose 2 points in terms of currency, one coming from a independence perspective, or one just as an observer of the current debate, and one coming from a particularly Catholic or Christian perspective. In terms of the current debate, I think it's been, I know Alex Salmon in that debate with Alistair Darling spoke about how there were 3 plan Bs, and certainly the First Minister's Currency Commission came up with 4 options, or 4 obvious options for the Scottish currency. The use of the pound sterling in a formal currency union, I think is the overwhelming likelihood. It's the policy of the Scottish Government. I think it's likely what the rest of the UK will go for as well. I remember watching a briefing prior to the referendum campaign from an internal BBC briefing by the then economics correspondent, I think she was, Stephanie Flanders, who said that in the campaign it's in the interests of everybody, and particularly the British government, to talk up the differences and the difficulties, and then after a vote, it's a yes vote, it's their job to talk down the difficulties and minimise the differences in order to come up with a very workable solution. I think there'd be a remarkable outbreak of common sense come September the 19th. So, but I thought what was interesting in terms of the 4 options put forward by the Currency Commission, in terms of a pound, formal currency union, a pound not a formal currency union, Scottish currency and the euro, is that we're starting to think about gearing the economy towards the needs of growth in Scotland. Now, a particularly Catholic point in terms of that, or coming from Catholic social teaching that I'm talking about, I think that really from the document referred to earlier on, Rerum Novarum, there were various politicians over the next 150 years, or really intellectuals in the British Isles, most notably people like the English writer G.K. Chesterton or Hilaire Belloc. Into the 1960s, there was a German economist who was based in England called Ernst Fritz Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. And I think it's recognised, I think there's a, the argument of the No campaign which has really been the argument of the 19th to 20th century, that big is best. Whereas I think the argument is there to be made that small is beautiful. And that one of the errors that we've fallen into over the past 50, 60 years in Scotland and elsewhere across the Western world is that we have ceded power upwards to an incredibly high level. So one of the sadnesses that when you go from town to town across Scotland, as I've been doing over the past few months, is not only seeing the war memorials, but also in every town coming across an empty borough chambers. Borough chambers that are available for, this is the Borough Hall. Is this where the Borough Council used to meet?
Yes.
So you come across borough halls, which are available for weddings, and they're available for tea dances, and they're available for pensioners clubs and toddlers groups. And the one thing they don't have is a borough council, the one thing they're made for. And in this campaign, I'd look at the writing and the work of the likes of, say, Leslie Riddoch, the journalist, in her book Blossom, where she charts that the average size of local government unit in Scotland is 175,000 people, which is actually bigger than some European countries. Whereas in Europe it's somewhere on the scale of 10 times less than that. And it is that point about subsidiarity, that when you empower people at the lowest possible level, remarkable things do happen. And I think that's true in finance as well. I think that we've seen that one of the points of Catholic social teaching developed by the likes of Belloc and Chesterton and Schumacher was to say, look, unbridled capitalism means that power, wealth and influence are vested in the few and the many are disenfranchised.
Yes.
And what we want to create is a system where power, wealth and influence, actually the many are empowered. And that's why I think when I was campaigning in Glasgow North East, you could see the remarkable outcomes for the likes of credit unions, or even if you want to look into the private sector. I think you could see during the banking crisis the stability and the social responsibility of small-scale banks, for example, the Argyll Savings Bank.
Yeah.
So, example, during the banking crisis, the Argyll Savings Bank, where their chief executive took a pay cut in order to lead by example. It's headed up by a community board, none of whom take remuneration, and that was to some extent the traditional model of savings bank across Scotland. Again, with that big is best mentality in the 1960s, they all went into the trustees' saving banks, which then went into the Lloyds Group, and we saw what happened. So I would hope, as is often said at these meetings, that independence isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning. And part and parcel of that post-independence politics is not just the repatriation of power to the national level here in Scotland, but including financially and in other ways, we look at empowering at a much lower level.
Another question?
Yes, first of all, let me say that I greatly enjoyed both speeches. I thought that both our speakers, both Mr. Kerr and Reverend Tony Bryson, put forward a very clear and a very sound exposition of Christian principles with regard to poverty and injustice in society. And I think that whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic, I happen to be a Church of Scotland elder and church treasurer, you would be difficult to being a Christian and disagreeing with the concepts which we put forward. So on that level, I'm in total agreement with you. But I think we come to this question of subsidiarity, we come in point of fact to the question of, right, we know what we want as Christians. We want to deal with poverty and we want to deal with injustice. Right? So what we have to decide is what the appropriate method is to do it, and secondly, what the appropriate level at which it has to be done. Now, we also have got, I feel, to be inclusive. Right? I was slightly, when we were talking about Scotland, we were talking about Scots and English, and etc. I was slightly reminded of St. Paul and his entreaties that people could be Christians without being Jews, and that whether you were a Jew or a Gentile didn't matter. Well, to me, whether you're an Englishman or a Scotsman doesn't matter. You still are entitled to justice, and you're still entitled to live in heaven. Now, the question is, at what level do you have your government to do that? Because however much local initiatives can work, they are almost inevitably funded from central government or from local government. So I think we've got to decide what is the best mechanism. And to me, the question of the referendum is basically about mechanism. The three of us wouldn't disagree about it at all. But we would, the question arises, is a UK government a more effective mechanism for doing it than a Scottish government? Right? I mean, a fully independent Scottish government. The present Scottish government actually has a lot of powers that could do an awful lot more in that field. So the question is, which is the more effective? And if you had a Scottish government which was tied, as is the plan, by a currency union to the Bank of England, I think you find, if you read the white paper, that fiscal matters and interest rates would in fact be determined in London. They would be determined by the Bank of England in conjunction with a representative from the Scottish government. So you wouldn't really have any change. Your Scottish government's fiscal program would be, to a large extent, tied to that of the United Kingdom, even though you own the part of it.
Can I interrupt?
So my question is, this is about Italians, isn't it, rather than about principles?
No. Can I start off? When I was a young laddie, I played in Dunfermline Abbey and round Canmore's Keep. And round Canmore's Keep, I found an old penny. It was actually a half penny, right? And ever since I've discovered through history that Scotland had its own pound a long time ago, and it's probably the oldest currency in Europe. And I found an old penny with Canmore's face on it, and I gave it to my father, and my father still got it to the day. Let me say politically and economically, from a historical point of view, that we have already been here before. Our economy collapsed, and I can't remember the date nor the time, but it was all to do with the fact that Scotland was a very prosperous place, and we made and we created a leather that Europe couldn't make. We had a special technique, especially in Fife and Curris, where we got leather, and Kinghorn's still got a leather tan in place yet, where we make this very fine, soft leather, and Europe couldn't get enough of it. And what happened was, because of the economics, Edward I decided, because he was greedy, and here I'm back to this bit that Jesus said, that, the root of all evil is money. So Edward I got a great opportunity to attack Scotland because its king got lost one night and fell off a cliff with his horse in the fall. And then somehow, strangely, his daughter was sent to Norway. And for some strange, unknown reason, this ship was scuppered in a storm which was never there. And he took the opportunity to capitalise on the strength of the Scottish economy, because the English economy was failing. And what happened is, as the years rolled in, the economy was getting bled dry. Robert the Bruce came up and tried to sort it out. He alleviated the problem for a while, and then the Scottish economy collapsed because of external pressures on the economy, to the point where the pound collapsed. So the two governments or two parliaments got together. So the Bank of Scotland had to merge with the Bank of England to form the new pound note, and that's where the new pound in England, in the English monetary system, came. And that's history, and that's where we've been here before. What can be tied can be unsevered.
So you're advocating an independent Scottish currency?
I'd love to have our own currency, and I don't see why not. In a just society and a world that we live in today, we live in a Europe, we live in a world that's supposed to be just. Why can we know, as an independent nation, have our own old pound note back? You know, the one was at 50 shillings, you know? And then Ted would come along and halved it in two. And when I went down and I had, you know, my shilling ended up sixpence. You know, half the value. And I could no longer buy my toffee cartons. I was, you know the famous toffee? Right? I can always remember the first day after when the money changed. And I went down with the exact money, the old money, to buy my toffee carton. And I couldn't buy it because I was a halfpenny short. Because it was no longer threepence, it was a ton. See, and that was a wee boy working that out. So why can we not have, as an independent Scotland, our own money? What's wrong with that? If we're independent, let's go the whole hog. Yeah. And I know why, because if we do go that way, this is what will happen. And working on that man, what he said and suggested about the money involved in Scotland is, when we start to separate it, then we will see the holes in it, and we will see the skullduggery and the corruption that's involved with the capital that's grown and developed and nurtured in Scotland. The capital of the United Kingdom, 23% of the economy, 20% of that economy is the capital net gain in this country, which gets invested and borrowed upon. Take that away, then the UK as it stands has no capital whatsoever to work with. And that's what they're frightened of. And if Gordon Brown and all the others, if we get our independence, we will see them for what they really are.
I think it's absolutely right to say, Ronnie, that the principle of subsidiarity is subjective, and it's for us to use our wits in order to, and evidence in order to come to the best practical solution.
But last one, you're not talking about the Christian principle, you're talking about what you term prudential judgment. Is that the most effective way of doing it, or is something else?
Well, yeah, that's it. It's taking that general principle in order to come to prudential judgment as to how that is best applied in a particular situation. I think within this context that the principle of subsidiarity is best served in terms of economic matters, clearly, by a yes vote on September the 18th for two reasons, to deal with two of the points you made. Number one, to recognise that there should be greater empowerment at a local level, including economically. The traditional Scottish principle, which we see from most notably in the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, a remarkable document for a time, because it seems to, it's not proposing mass enfranchisement or modern democracy, but it does have this remarkable statement about Robert Bruce being the King of Scots, insofar as he upholds the rights of the nation, and so far as he doesn't, we reserve the right to remove him. So I think we've seen, throughout Scottish history, there seems to be this bottom-up mentality. To some extent, it's that bottom-up mentality in terms of empowerment that leads us to a Reformation which is Presbyterian in its mindset, rather than one that's Episcopalian. And when Episcopalianism is imposed, or is attempted to be imposed by Charles I, there's Jenny Geddes with the milking stool in St Giles Cathedral, saying there were no mass preached in Malloch. But to some extent, it was that instinct of bottom-up empowerment, and I think there is a real case to be made and I think it's the movement post-independence towards greater local empowerment, including fiscally as well. There's no point having lower-level institutions if they simply work off a block grant from central government. To have a greater degree of local taxation, obviously has to be offset against central taxation as well. COSLA recently issued a document on behalf of the local authorities suggesting a much lower level of local authority. I think the figure was 100 local authorities in a future settlement. Second thing, in terms of...
Parliament has power to do that already, if it so wishes.
It could, but what it doesn't have the fiscal powers, and this is about. So you talk about what difference does it make if we stick with, if what happens is the option of a currency union and a shared pound with the rest of the UK. If that happens, the argument is, what difference does that make? Because your monetary policy is still decided in London. Sounds plausible, but it's wrong. The reason being, the Bank of England is a shared, joint, nationalised venture. It's Scotland's central, despite the name, it's Scotland's central bank, as well as England's central bank at the moment. If that continues, then post-independence, you could see two things. One, I think there'll be a more formalised Scottish representation on the Monetary Policy Committee. There's no official Scottish input on that committee at present. If you happen to have a Scot on it, it's just by chance. And yes, it would mean that you end up with a shared interest rate for both states. But what it frees up and empowers the Scottish Government to do, you've got to remember, interest rates is only one economic lever in terms of economic levers of control. If you look at the big five taxation powers, which presently either almost entirely or entirely lie with Westminster, those being corporation tax, income tax, VAT, excise duty, all the money from whisky, and oil and gas revenue, they all lie with Westminster. Those powers would then reside with a Scottish Government. So it's a huge difference in terms of fiscal manoeuvrability and in terms of fiscal powers. Obviously, in terms of stability, the Scottish Government believe that that would be best served by a currency union and a shared pound. I think that's most likely to happen. But actually, if we went down the road that Tommy's advocating, I think we'd do just fine as well.
Okay.
And the nice thing is we're getting fiscal policy tailored to the Scottish economy. There are.
Well, can we just leave that one at the moment, because we're not all accountants in here, unfortunately. But if we can have the gentleman with the sweater with another question, please.
Sure. Bit background on myself. My name's James McCready. I am a teacher of religious and moral education in the secondary sector, and within that sector we've had Curriculum for Excellence, which has brought in a new subject within religious and moral education, which is about religion and conflict. So I've just taught this at National 5 for a year, focusing on religion and conflict, which is the background of where my question is coming from, because I'm thinking of the nuclear issue. Now, as a Christian, mutually assured destruction goes against, if your enemy strikes you in one cheek, give him the other to do it in also. And when I think of President Assad in Syria, he had chemical weapons and wasn't going to use them up until a point where what happened is something changed his mind and he decided to use them. We have nuclear weapons in this country. It is a weapon that affects people into several generations. It is a weapon that affects you to the molecular level with mutations in DNA. What I am thinking is, why has the Church, when I think of it, as far as I'm aware, okay, it may have changed, the Church of Scotland, the last that I had checked, were supportive of a campaign for nuclear disarmament, but they were, when it came to the referendum, keeping a neutral viewpoint. When you've got an opportunity to actually rid our portion of the world of a weapon that is the most unchristian weapon to support, that I can't see why anybody who would call themselves a Christian would actually take this not miss out on this opportunity to rid the world of a weapon of such magnitude that will kill them? Why is the Church of Scotland actually still sitting on the fence?
I think myself that what's really happening is that most Christians in the Church of Scotland are no realising the opportunity, and I mean the word realise, that it's here and now. I have a lot of friends who have camped out at the nuclear place in Fast Lane, and they've lain on the ground many times, Christian ministers and everything, to no avail, none whatsoever. Totally against the appalling description of a nuclear weapon of such mass destruction. I was reading a book called Theology After Hiroshima, and the one thing that the author said, I can't remember his name, but he did say this and I remember it. He said the one thing that human beings have become as expert killers, and we are. And that's all due to that old-fashioned word sin. You know, we think sin is nothing, but sin is very integral, it's very deep, it's very concerned. It's a very old word, and it's out of language now. While we preach, and while we teach, and while we talk, we never commit ourselves to the walk. And all the Christians talk that way. Talk the talk, walk the walk, but when it comes to it, there's no walk. You see, at the end of the day, so sometimes I feel they're too fine and too comfortable. I live in an age, and this is for a mentor. You know, I live in a church, in a society, that the preachers are fat and their theology is thin. And it's absolutely true. Have you ever seen a Church of Scotland minister? I've got friends, I was at a friend's funeral that were on a blow, and these are great ministers I'm talking about. The pulpit was built narrow because the minister was thin and the theology was far. Now Bob's good side. And Bob
So you're suggesting that ministers get weighed before they are admitted to the ministry?
Yes. David's going to come back.
Just one thing, James, which your comment, which I absolutely agree with, reminded me of. This was the advert from a couple of weeks ago that was in the Sunday Herald, where a brave band of Church of Scotland ministers, including Tommy, signed up to the statement that we believe that a yes vote in the forthcoming referendum makes possible a more socially just Scotland. And amongst the names there was the former moderator, Andrew McLennan, and he said this, and I'll end.
He's been on a diet.
He's been on a diet, as pulpit's done, and his theology is fat, because he said, Andrew McLennan said, the worst thing in Scotland is Trident. September 18th is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to remove the worst thing in Scotland. Speaking against nuclear weapons is good, campaigning against nuclear weapons is good, and praying for their abolition is good. But what will change everything is voting yes in the referendum. Living in a Scotland free of nuclear weapons will make everything else better. Scotland.
Gentlemen, right at that.
My name is Bobby Hamilton, and a sinner saved by grace. I'd like to ask a fairly straightforward question from a biblical principle. I mean, we talk about the ruin of Great Britain as we've seen it in the past 45 years. I would say there's a common denominator in, if you start with, to speed the thing up, I'm not being disrespectful, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Gordon Brown, to a lesser extent Tarbert, but certainly handcuffed to the atheist Nick Clegg. Then the common point is that the country has been ruled for some time now without a religious leader. The point that Mr. Kerr made, that the people don't have a say, is primarily in my lifetime because those at the top will not have a listen. It's correct to say that the people didn't have a say in the entry into the Iraq War, but a slogan that the current President Obama uses: we have a long memory and we have a long reach. And when the time came, the people voted and they took out the Blairs, they took out the Browns, they took out Toryism in Scotland, probably never again to be voted in. So yes, we didn't sit in silence. We sat because no one listened. There was no Christianity within Parliament or within leadership. The point the question that I would like to ask, without it being
members of both Catholic Church and Church of Scotland and of other faiths. And I think when Scotland's moving forward, although we are here as Christians for independence, the opportunity we have for a country that has mutual respect for all other faiths, I think is important. And that's a real benefit of voting yes, with mutual respect. And certainly within your question specifically with regard to the SNP, there are Christians in the SNP, there are Muslims in the SNP, and there are atheists, no doubt, in the SNP.
well,
We're all Jock Tamson's bairns, and I think that's...
Why then within that period of devolution have we seen the creation of food banks? Where has been the SNP voice?
Well, the SNP voice and the SNP government, from my perspective, and I'm speaking as an SNP councillor, is that it has been mitigated. The legislation which came in for the bedroom tax, for example, which has a direct effect on how poverty affects our people. For example, in Argyll and Burgh, we had a figure initially of 800. That's now dwindled down to 470, I think, at the last count. 470 families in Argyll and Burgh who were affected by the bedroom tax. Now, who introduced the bedroom tax? Labour, believe it or not, in Westminster. It came from them. Who implemented it? The Tories and the Lib Dems, and who then put in place mitigation against that. Some would argue that maybe the SNP government shouldn't have done it because it wasn't of their making. But because of the concern of the SNP government and the majority in Holyrood, they put money in to mitigate the bedroom tax. And when I hear Margaret Curran and other Labour MPs and MSPs turning around how delighted they are to open a food bank in Scotland, and it makes my blood boil, because there's no way anyone should be happy about that situation. So I think Christ works in and throughout all the parties. I think that's the great thing here as Christians for independence. I think Christians are in throughout the society, and we have to make our voice heard in order to try and prove things. But I'll shut up and let you come back in for a quick comment.
Last point. I've already put my cross for Jesus Christ who died for me, and I thank him for it. The thing is, I don't see, and I'm not here to in any way throw hand grenades at SNP. My fear, my worry, as I lead up to the date, is I do not see Christianity of any shape within the current SNP leadership.
Well,
and I don't see, although they share walking distance, that collaboration between the SNP, Holyrood, and the Church of Scotland in George Street.
Listen, can I come in here? Right. On a personal level, as a minister, I can assure you that within the ranks of the SNP, there are a great number of Christians.
Yeah, but again, with respect, sir, I'm not asking.
They have.
I'm not asking about the ranks. I'm talking about the leadership.
I'm talking about the
It's the
leadership.
same leadership that
No,
fractures the majors.
wait a minute,
that
that's
teaches
very-
into
that's
the
very
demise
questionable.
of Great Britain. What country in the world would have allowed its core industries, the mining, the shipbuilding, the steel, to road? I'm speaking to
Sorry,
the panel, please.
can we just have a moment?
Listen, I'm just trying to answer the question about Christians in the Scottish National Party. And what I'm trying to say to you is that there are, in the top level as well. And I've been with them, I've supped
Can you
with
name them,
them.
please?
No.
Well, I know in terms of, okay,
They also have, before I finish, and this is what I want to say,
It's three questions to be answered.
the Scottish Parliament, they have, steered by the SNP, they have a prayer breakfast. And I'm often invited to it, where there is a number of Christians who attend, who they get speakers up, and really good speakers, and fantastic speakers, and we pray prayerfully to God and Jesus Christ. And there are Christians there. And if you just step back a wee bit, you'll see that these people are trying to walk the walk.
Yeah, again,
Michael, this will
once
bring in
again,
some-
with respect, it's the leaders who call the decisions.
No,
And
the
Alan
second-
Salmon's father was a minister.
The second tier.
sorry. Sir, could I just come over here to Mike Bryson?
Well, I'd just like to make a point here that with all due respect to the question that's been asked, it's entirely irrelevant.
Yeah.
What is relevant here is voting for independence and in 2016 voting for the people that you want. And if you want to vote for people who are Christians, or Muslims, or atheists, you do it then. This is the opportunity now to make that change. To the question about what the SNP does or doesn't do is completely irrelevant.
Okay, thank you. We're going to Jamie now.
Okay, I feel I shouldn't be here because I don't see myself. I think this has been the best debate and the best speakers and I've been to nearly every one of these meetings and it's usually MPs or MSPs that are there, and I think it's been you're as an academic. That was a great speech or whatever that you gave. And Tommy, I have to say to you, I feel I'm a humanist, but you have certainly challenged my me. I was brought up in a home in the Church of Scotland and the Revere Quarriers homes, and my whole life was religion, and I was against it all. But listening to you, and you brought a tear to my eye. I think it was one of the best. I would come to your church, and my question is, would you accept a humanist to become a Christian? But I have a dilemma whether, I feel a humanist, but actually you've stirred up my kind of Christian bit again, and I just wonder, is it acceptable? Can you be a humanist and a Christian?
You could. I'll try and answer your question in simple terms. Many people are living with this dilemma because the Church of Scotland is absolutely rudderless. Right? There is a huge dilemma in religion at the moment. And it's to do with the words religion and religion. There are a great number of people like yourself who are becoming humanists because of the religious aspect. Now, I advocate and I will defend and I will fight hard for Christianity in the sense that Christianity is not a religion, it's something more than religion. Religion is a belief system based on numbers of beliefs, and you can look it up in the dictionary that religion is a belief system religion is, because we see so many images on the television and people who are Christians supporting trident missiles and all these kind of things. A long time ago, when the Roman Empire became Christian, what happened was that the Armenians, who were pacifists and they didn't believe in killing, they become Christian, and the Christians didn't believe in, they believed in thou shalt not kill. So they abstained from warfare. And the Romans had to set a different principle for them because they were Christians. They were allowed to come into the army, but they weren't asked to kill or fight. You see, and we've lost all these things because of this idea of religion. And I could name other religions. You know, the Episcopalian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, you know, the Judaism, Islam. They are all religious systems that are based on a belief. We are above that and beyond that. We believe in a man called Jesus Christ. And we follow him. Does anybody know what it is to follow a man like that? I've had the privilege of following somebody all my life who I've put in, and it's just an ordinary man. Now, I was taught by him to be a disciple, and the problem is that the majority of Christians didn't know what it is to be a disciple. To follow a single man and put your whole heart and mind into that single person. Because what happens is Jesus Christ, if we're really truthful, he shows us what it is to be human. Absolutely human. To make mistakes, to err, and to die. And what happens is we end up with too many humanists in the country because of this religious aspect. And my point is that you can believe in God, you don't have to be religious.
One of our objectives for this meeting tonight is Christians for Independence.
Yes.
In a jokey time, we'll say, well, maybe we'll convert one or two to the yes, and if we're really good, maybe we'll convert one or two to Christ. And I think we've achieved that, God willing. But we'll have a question.
Could I just make a point? Could I say, God save us from any Scottish Parliament judgments, politicians, or what religion they are, and not how they govern us? I mean, if we are going to a situation where you have to ask a guy what religion is before you elect him, I think we're in dangerous waters.
My name is Dennis Moore. I'm a member of the Green Party, the West County locally. Now, we were a wonderful planet was created for us, and we're gradually destroying it. It's mostly for good money. And we forget about independent countries and everything else if this carries on. What would a free Scotland do to help to preserve the planet? Slow it down, slow this global warming down.
David, you're right.
Okay, on that point, and then the general point. On that point, I think one of the things we've seen since our Parliament was re-established, I was there on that first day back in 1999, when Winnie Ewan, as the oldest member of the Parliament, had the opportunity to say, the Scottish Parliament adjourned on the 22nd of July 1707 is hereby reconvened. It was a great moment. And since then, the Scottish Parliament, in terms of environmental policy, has been able to lead the way and be an exemplar very often at environmental conferences to the rest of the world. And it's a reminder to us that if we can do those things both differently and well, those powers we've been given, then why can't we also do it when it comes to the powers of defence, of foreign policy, or the economy? And on a general point, my dad used to always say to me, there's a kind of, I think, a Catholic mentality in the west of Scotland to keep your head down. Don't mention your school. One of the worst moments was when I was younger, in my dad's golf club. I said, Dad, Sunday, I said, we better go, Dad. He said, we've got to go to Mass, which is like, it's like farting in the presence of the Queen. It's like, you just don't mention it. And my dad would always say to me, never talk about football, religion or politics.
Yes.
And tonight we've dealt with football, religion and politics, but it's great. It's absolutely great, as you say. What else is there to talk about? And as regards on the religious point, because that's obviously come up, and you know, the SNP and the religiosity of the SNP, and I think two very good points have been made in response to that. Remembering that the 18th of September is really nothing to do with the SNP, it's nothing to do with Alex Salmon, it's to do with us and, you know, independence, which will be a settlement that will benefit our children and grandchildren, as you say, Tommy, when Alex Salmond is no longer in office and perhaps the SNP is no more. So it's a much longer term decision, a much greater significance and worth than just one political party. In terms of leadership of the SNP, and in terms of, as somebody who's a member of the SNP, when you look at the leadership of the SNP, it probably kind of reflects Scottish society as a whole. In Scottish society, the last census is about 50% of people identify themselves as Christian, and on a Sunday, you get about 10% of us go to church, which is actually still a very big number. You know, it's about 500,000 people. I mean, you think there's about 50,000 going to the Scottish Premier League on a Saturday. You know, Christianity is still significant, but that's the kind of numbers. And if you go to a conference, an SNP conference, you'll find yourself, I'll find myself at Mass, and there's Rosanna Cunningham, and there's Michael Matheson, Justice Minister, or Legal Affairs Minister, and Michael, who's Health Minister. John Swinney's sometimes there, he's Church of Scotland. You know, and you can kind of see it reflects society as a whole. And in terms of that society as a whole, this is more a point for Christianity than it is for politics. You know, a point that Pope Benedict would quite often make, who I followed for 2 years, is that the traditional Western conception of society, really from medieval times through to the Enlightenment, was that faith, reason and science were all compatible one with the other. If faith, reason and science all came from God, then they should all be compatible one with the other, and we should be able to give a reasonable explanation as to why that is so. That's what the likes of St. Augustine did, or 500 years later, that's what St. Thomas Aquinas did. And Pope Benedict's point was always that really from the Enlightenment onwards, both at the level of the intellectual classes and then into general society, you get a breakdown in that synthesis between faith and reason and science and the other. So much so, I think, in the popular mindset, and certainly amongst the intellectual classes, the two are either seen as mutually exclusive or downright hostile one to the other. And if somebody's religion, well, that's nice for you, you go to church. You know, but it's nothing to do with the real world, which is the world of reason and the world of science. So to some extent, the modern world, you know, as you say, you're open to reason and persuasion, but they're not persuaded intellectually of the case for the existence of God or the divinity of Jesus Christ. And that's really the job of the church, I suppose, in the 21st century, what Pope Benedict used to refer to as a new evangelisation, that there has to be an appeal to the heart, but also to the head, as Peter says in the New Testament, to be able to give reason for the hope that is within us, as to why the existence of God and the divinity of Jesus Christ, why the incarnation makes sense, why it's reasonable. As Christ says, you know, to love God with not just your heart and your soul, but also with our mind. Our mind's very important. And I think that the modern world, not just intellectual classes, but society as a whole, that the proposition of Christianity, if it's the existence of God or life after death or anything, you know, the proclaimers say, Lord, I want to be a Christian, but I think people find that intellectually tough. And that's the job of Christianity, I suppose, in the 21st century, is that new evangelisation, as Tommy says, to represent the person of Jesus Christ, which is what it's all about. He is what it's all about. But to do it in a way which is, as Augustine did, as Aquinas did, to do it in a way which is reasonable, which appeals to the heart, but also appeals to the mind as well, and to some extent heals that fissure which has existed since the Enlightenment onwards between faith and reason and science, and to once again show that there is a synthesis between all three and represent that to society. And if that happens, and if there is a new evangelisation, then that would be reflected also, I'd imagine, in all walks of life, including our political class. At present, I think the political class probably reflect to some extent where society as a whole is at.
I'm very conscious of the time. I didn't realise we'd leathered around for so long. We did a wee bit, but we've had a thoroughly enjoyable evening, and I hope you have too. I think we'll have one last question. Yes, gentleman.
My name's Glenn McCormick. And a lot of the people are going to be surprised and displeased at what I'm going to say. I'm not proud to be Scottish, not proud at all. I would have been proud to be Scottish when 1970 we had put in a majority of nationalist MPs so that we could have got freedom. Now, my family always voted ILP and then voted Labour. They promised us home rule for Scotland. We got a majority Labour government in 1945. We didn't get socialism and we didn't get home rule. So I'm not proud to be Scottish. Let's hope I'll be proud after the September. I would like to say, looking at the General Assembly, I think it was a wee bit on the fat side, an MP, not one of the ministers. I think his name was Joe Robertson. I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but he was proud to be voting no. How can you be a Christian and allow somebody to put your finger on that button? You can't be a Christian unless you're a unilateralist, as we speaking for CND now.
Can I say something to just historically? The first established Scottish Labour Party was in 1893. And it was established with another party called the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, who instituted a revolt in the shipyards. And I think they were called the Red Siders. Red Clydesiders. And they formed the Scottish Labour Party.